He walked into court with the truth on his side, but the judge only saw the color of his skin. What started as a trial became a takedown, until one moment changed everything. Marcus James walked into the courtroom with his head held high, his navy blue suit sharp and pressed, a quiet dignity in every step. Behind him trailed his mother, clutching her purse tightly, and his younger sister, eyes wide with hope. He wasn't just defending his business. He was defending his name, his dreams, his family's sacrifices. And he believed, naively perhaps, that the truth would be enough. But the moment Judge Raymond Locke looked up from the bench and locked eyes with Marcus, something in the air shifted. You could feel it. Thick, subtle, but unmistakable, like the change in pressure before a storm. The judge's eyes didn't linger on the documents or the details of the case. No. They settled on Marcus's face, and then drifted lower, as if taking in the full weight of his presence. Not his suit, not his evidence, his skin. Marcus saw it too. A flicker, a tightening of the jaw, a moment too long before the judge spoke, and when he did, it was with the kind of tone used not for the innocent or even the accused, but for the presumed guilty. The case was straightforward. Marcus, a self-made tech entrepreneur, had created an app that gained rapid traction in underrepresented communities. It empowered small businesses, especially black-owned ones, to access tools previously reserved for major corporations. It was praised in industry circles, even caught the attention of investors. But when a rival tech company, helmed by the son of a senator, filed a lawsuit claiming Marcus had stolen their source code, a claim Marcus could disprove with dated records and independent audits, the case still made it to trial. That should have been the first red flag. Marcus's lawyer, Angela Patel, was one of the best in the city. She laid out the evidence clearly. Timestamps, development logs, witness statements from his team, expert testimony. The opposition? Smoke and mirrors. Their arguments leaned more on implication than proof, more on assumption than fact. But they had something Marcus didn't: the right last names and the comfort of being seen as one of us in that courtroom. Judge Locke overruled every meaningful objection Angela raised. He interrupted her cross-examinations, allowed the opposing counsel to go off topic, and dismissed every technical explanation Marcus's team tried to offer. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't even coded. It was blatant. Every time Marcus spoke, trying to explain himself, the judge's eyes narrowed. His voice grew sharp, clipped, impatient, as though Marcus were a nuisance, not a citizen exercising his right to defend himself. When the plaintiff's witnesses contradicted themselves, Locke didn't flinch. But when Marcus's developer, a white man, supported Marcus's timeline, the judge interrupted and questioned his credibility. It was no longer a trial. It was a takedown. In the gallery, Marcus's mother sat still, lips pressed together, pride warring with fear. She had seen this before. This quiet erasure, this invisible hand that tilted the scales. She had taught her son to speak with clarity, to carry himself with excellence, to believe in the system. But now she gripped her purse tighter, praying that her son's light wouldn't be snuffed out under the weight of a prejudice older than the Constitution. By the time closing arguments came, the outcome already felt sealed. The jury, hand-picked in a pool that somehow ended up with only one person of color, watched passively. Some looked sympathetic, others looked bored. And Judge Locke? He didn't even look at Marcus when he gave his final instructions. "They say justice is blind," Angela whispered to Marcus as they stood for the jury's return. But today, she peeked through the blindfold and saw only color. Marcus nodded, not with defeat, but with understanding. Whatever the verdict, he knew now what he was truly fighting. Not just for his company, not just for his name, but for the right to be seen, not as a threat, or a symbol, but as a man. The gavel came down like thunder, and justice, silent as she was, did not speak for him. Not that day. Marcus had built his life from scratch. He was the son of a single mother who juggled 2 jobs and 3 side hustles just to keep the lights on. They lived in a cramped apartment in a forgotten neighborhood where sirens sang lullabies at night and ambition was a fragile thing, easily crushed. But Marcus had grit in his bones and brilliance in his blood. From the moment he learned how to take apart an old desktop computer at age 11, he knew technology would be his way out. He poured himself into books, coding tutorials, community college classes, anything that could teach him how to build something no one could take away. By 27, Marcus had done what few believed possible. He launched a tech startup focused on empowering small, minority-owned businesses with affordable tools: analytics, digital storefronts, marketing automation. His company, Umoja Tech, began to make waves. Clients doubled every quarter, and a round of investors came knocking. But with success came jealousy and threats to the old guard. That's when it started. A rival firm, much larger and politically connected, filed a civil suit accusing Marcus of fraud and intellectual property theft. No hard evidence, just vague claims and carefully twisted paperwork meant to imply wrongdoing. A few spreadsheets taken out of context, a former disgruntled employee making speculative statements. It was all smoke and mirrors. Marcus had documentation, signed contracts, timestamps, and sworn statements from his developers that disproved every accusation. Still, he believed in the system. He believed that truth, presented clearly, would rise above noise. That belief shattered the moment he met Judge Raymond Locke. From the first day of the trial, something felt off. Locke, a man with a reputation for being tough but fair, showed none of the latter. The courtroom felt colder when Marcus walked in. It wasn't overt racism, not the kind you could call out and name, but it was there. In the narrowed gaze, the clipped tone, the micro-expressions that spoke volumes. The prosecutor, well-dressed, well-connected, and from one of the city's legacy law firms, was given the floor with almost reverent silence. He rambled, speculated, offered half-truths like they were gospel, and Judge Locke let him. No interruptions, no objections sustained, just a nod and a polite proceed. But the moment Marcus's attorney, Angela Patel, rose to speak, everything changed. Locke interrupted constantly, rolled his eyes, asked irrelevant questions. When Marcus tried to clarify a technical point, the judge would sigh, glance at the clock, or wave him off with dismissive irritation. "Stick to the facts," Locke would say, even when Marcus was doing exactly that. More than once, Angela caught the judge exchanging looks with the prosecutor, subtle but telling. It wasn't just courtroom decorum that was breaking. It was the very promise of neutrality. Marcus could feel it in his bones. This wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even a real trial. It was theater, and the verdict had been scripted from the start. Even the jury noticed. There was a young woman in the front row, maybe in her late 20s, who flinched every time Locke snapped at Marcus. An older black man on the jury shook his head slowly when objections from Marcus's team were overruled without cause. You could sense the discomfort. But Judge Locke's presence was overbearing. He commanded the room with the kind of authority that silences dissent before it can find voice. And that was the trick. It wasn't about shouting or slurs. It was about posture, tone, disproportion, giving one side space and time while crushing the other under weight and scrutiny. It was about creating an imbalance so complete that even the truth couldn't find its footing. Marcus sat at the defense table, hands folded tightly to stop the shaking, watching as his years of work, his reputation, his legacy, were slowly unraveled not by evidence, but by performance, not by facts, but by favoritism, not by justice, but by the absence of it. He had come in believing the truth would be enough, but under Judge Locke's gavel, it never had a chance to speak. Judge Raymond Locke had a record, not the kind printed in official reports or tracked on government databases, but the kind passed quietly from lawyer to lawyer, muttered in courthouse hallways, and referenced with careful glances over shoulders. It was a pattern, subtle, but undeniable. Out of the last 20 black defendants who stood trial in his courtroom, 18 had received the maximum sentence allowed under the law. The other 2 had only narrowly avoided the same fate thanks to extraordinary media pressure. On paper, Locke's rulings looked strict but legally sound. But if you looked deeper, read between the lines, and listened to those who'd been there, attorneys, clerks, even a few jurors, you'd see the truth. Judge Locke wasn't just tough. He was deliberate. And his version of justice had a color. In legal circles, they called it the Locke effect. Defense attorneys dreaded drawing him. Prosecutors quietly celebrated it. And in communities of color, particularly among black professionals, the name Locke was more than a judge. It was a warning. Still, when Marcus James's case was assigned to his courtroom, no one sounded an alarm. No public outcry. No recusal, no review. Because Judge Locke played his game within the margins, within the plausibility of judicial discretion. He just harsh enough to avoid obvious bias. He wielded the gavel like a scalpel, cutting credibility in ways that couldn't be easily appealed. But Marcus wasn't just any defendant. He wasn't a gang member, a repeat offender, or someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a tech CEO, a builder, a rising star with community roots and national attention. And that, in Locke's eyes, was exactly the problem. Because Marcus James didn't fit the box Judge Locke had long ago constructed in his mind for men who looked like him. The judge couldn't reconcile the image. A young black man in a tailored suit, fluent in code and capital markets, with Ivy League polish and inner-city scars. To Locke, Marcus wasn't an innovator, he was an anomaly, and anomalies to men like him were threats to the natural order. Behind his bench, Locke hid his biases well, until he didn't. It wasn't until months later, after the case had already drawn national attention, that the dam finally broke. A whistleblower inside the court clerk's office leaked a chain of internal emails, dated just days before Marcus's trial began. They were casual at first, jokes, side comments, but as the chain went on, the tone sharpened. One line stood out with chilling clarity. Another one of these young black tech CEOs, all flash, no substance. Bet he's just another scammer riding the race card. Another email read, "Funny how they all talk disruption and innovation, but when you pull back the curtain, it's just a hustle, faking success for clicks." Those emails were sent by Judge Locke, from his official account, during business hours, in conversation with former colleagues and legal peers. In those lines, Marcus's entire experience was explained. The interruptions, the eye rolls, the impatient tone, the clear favoritism toward the prosecution. It wasn't just courtroom demeanor. It was personal. Locke didn't see Marcus as a man defending his work. He saw him as a symbol he wanted to crush, a narrative he wanted to control. To Locke, Marcus was dangerous, not because of any crime, but because of what he represented. A future where power looked different, sounded different, came from different neighborhoods, wore different skin. And in his courtroom, that was unacceptable. The emails hit the press like a lightning bolt. Civil rights groups demanded an investigation. Activists flooded courthouse steps with signs bearing Marcus's face and the phrase, "Innovation is not a crime." Legal scholars called for Judge Locke's immediate removal, and Marcus, still reeling from the verdict, finally saw the larger picture. His trial hadn't been about the law, It had been about image, about fear, about a system clinging to its definitions of legitimacy. Judge Locke didn't just want to sentence Marcus. He wanted to shatter the mirror Marcus held up, one that forced people like him to confront a new reality. But Marcus wouldn't shatter. He would reflect harder, louder, brighter. Because no matter how many blindfolds justice wore, truth would always leave a glare. The trial reached its peak on the fourth day just after lunch, when Marcus James was finally called to the stand. The courtroom had grown used to tension by then. The sharp tone of Judge Locke, the constant objections from the prosecution, the visible frustration from Marcus's attorney, Angela Patel. But as Marcus took the oath and sat before the jury, the room seemed to inhale and hold its breath. He looked steady, composed. No tremor in his hands, no crack in his voice. He wore the same navy blue suit from day one, wrinkled now at the elbows, a little tighter around the shoulders, as if the pressure of the trial had made it shrink. Or maybe it was just the weight of everything he carried with him, his mother's sacrifices, his community's hopes, his own need for dignity. Angela began her questions slowly, carefully. Marcus explained each transaction in his business, walking the jury through the contracts he'd signed, the development phases of his app, the investors who had come aboard, and the measures he'd taken to ensure compliance. He brought receipts, literally and figuratively, email threads with timestamps, signed agreements, tax documents, testimonies from accountants, clients, and engineers who vouched for his innovation and integrity. He answered each question with clarity and confidence, not arrogance. He wasn't a man trying to escape something. He was a man finally getting a chance to speak after days of being spoken about, dissected, and doubted. And that's precisely why it didn't sit right with Judge Locke. Midway through Marcus's testimony, after a particularly damning piece of evidence was introduced, an email that directly contradicted the prosecution's core claim, the judge shifted in his chair. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. The courtroom, sensing the moment, grew utterly still. Marcus continued, explaining the timeline of a specific contract, pointing to discrepancies in the rival firm's allegations. He was calm, professional, honest. But then it happened. As Marcus began to respond to a question about the audit conducted on his company, one that had cleared him of any wrongdoing, Judge Locke abruptly slammed his gavel against the bench. "Enough of the performance," he barked, voice booming across the courtroom. "I've heard enough from you." The sound cracked through the silence like thunder. Everyone froze. Jurors looked to one another, unsure. Angela rose halfway out of her seat in protest, stunned. Even the prosecution, smug until that moment, seemed briefly taken aback. Marcus sat motionless for a second, lips parted as if trying to process what had just happened. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't grandstanding. He had simply been telling the truth. That's when he did something no one expected. He stood up, not in defiance, but in dignity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He just stood tall, as if reclaiming something invisible that had been taken from him the moment the trial began. He looked Judge Locke directly in the eye and said, calmly but firmly, "I didn't come here to be looked at like a criminal. I came here to be heard." The silence that followed was louder than the gavel. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, first in the gallery, then among the jurors. One of the court reporters paused mid-typing. Angela, frozen in place, blinked hard as if holding back tears. Cameras from local news stations captured the entire exchange, the moment freezing in frame. Marcus standing, back straight, hands at his sides, eyes locked with a judge who couldn't hide the flicker of fury, and maybe fear, on his face. That moment would change everything. Clips of Marcus's statement spread like wildfire online. Social media lit up. Hashtags like "Let Marcus Speak" and "Justice is Listening" began trending by evening. Civil rights attorneys, public figures, tech leaders, and journalists weighed in. The trial, once buried beneath legal jargon and courtroom monotony, became national conversation. What people saw wasn't just a trial. They saw a man standing in the fire, refusing to let it consume his voice. They saw a courtroom not of justice, but of judgment. And they saw courage, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that stands still and speaks truth to power. Marcus hadn't planned a moment. He hadn't written a speech. He simply reached the end of being dismissed and drew a line in the sand. And somehow, that one sentence echoed louder than any evidence ever could. What Judge Locke didn't know, what he never even considered, was that someone had been watching from the shadows of his courtroom, not with fear, but with quiet precision. In the last row of the gallery, past the reporters and curious spectators, sat a woman in a gray blazer and thick-rimmed glasses. Her name was Nia Caldwell, a legal activist, former public defender, and now the founder of Justice Track, a nonprofit organization that monitored racial bias in courtrooms. She had been tipped off weeks earlier by an anonymous email from a court clerk who had grown weary of Locke's behavior. The clerk had written just one sentence: "Someone needs to see what he's doing to this man." So Nia came. Day after day, she sat there, silent and unassuming, her laptop open, her phone discreetly recording snippets of audio and video. She noted every overruled objection, every time the prosecution was allowed to speculate, every time Marcus's lawyer was silenced mid-sentence. She logged Locke's tone, body language, and his dismissive remarks. She cataloged the imbalance, not just in rulings, but in respect. And when Marcus stood up that day, when he looked the judge dead in the eye and said, "I didn't come here to be looked at like a criminal. I came here to be heard," Nia knew it was time. She uploaded a 60-second clip to Justice Track's Twitter and TikTok pages. The footage showed Marcus's calm resolve and Locke's explosive interruption. The caption read, "This is not a fair trial. Watch how a judge shuts down a black CEO trying to defend his name." It took less than 48 hours for the firestorm to begin. By the next morning, major news outlets were airing the clip on rotation. CNN ran a segment titled "Justice or Prejudice." MSNBC hosted legal analysts who scrutinized Locke's courtroom behavior. The New York Times published an op-ed titled "When the Gavel is a Weapon." Social media erupted. Millions viewed the footage. Hashtags like #Justice for Marcus, #End Bias in Court, and #Judge Locke trended nationwide. Celebrities shared the post. Influential voices in tech and law came forward with their own stories of bias, of being talked down to, ignored, dismissed, not in the streets, but in courtrooms meant to uphold the law. More damning still, Nia and her team released a follow-up report, a detailed analysis of Judge Locke's last 10 years on the bench. The data was chilling. Over 85% of black defendants in his courtroom had received harsher penalties than their white counterparts charged with similar or lesser crimes. Objection patterns, sentencing disparities, misconduct complaints buried in bureaucratic red tape. Suddenly, Marcus's trial wasn't just about Marcus. It became a lightning rod, a mirror reflecting the cracks in the very system meant to protect the innocent and judge the guilty fairly. Legal experts began publicly questioning not just Locke's conduct, but how many more judges like him had gone unchecked. Former defendants came forward recounting similar stories. Whispers became noise, noise became outrage, and outrage brought accountability. The state appellate court stepped in within days, citing serious concerns about judicial impartiality. The verdict against Marcus was officially paused pending review. A full investigation into Judge Locke's conduct was launched by the Judicial Review Board. For the first time in his long ironclad career, Locke was no longer above reproach. He was being judged. Cameras now pointed at him when he entered the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters gathered with signs that read, "We see you now," and "Bias has a bench." He issued a statement through his office, claiming the attention was a coordinated smear campaign. But the damage was done. Marcus, meanwhile, stayed quiet in those first days, not out of fear, but because he understood that the silence after truth had been spoken was sacred. He watched as the world that had once tried to bury his voice now echoed it louder than he ever could have imagined. He hadn't just stood for himself. He had stood for every person who had been misjudged before ever speaking. Every dream deferred by a glance, a tone, a gavel struck too soon. And now the weight of judgment, the real kind, was shifting. This time, the system would have to answer for itself. In the end, truth found its voice, and Marcus James walked free. It took weeks of public pressure, days of legal deliberation, and a lifetime of injustice being brought to light. But when the final ruling came down from the appellate court, the outcome was clear. All charges against Marcus were dropped. There had been no fraud, no deceit, no criminal intent, only success. A success that someone had tried to sabotage. Marcus sat in that same courtroom where he had once stood, alone against a system that tried to crush him. And this time, he heard different words. Words like cleared of all allegations and wrongfully prosecuted. Angela Patel, his attorney and one of his fiercest advocates, held back tears as the ruling was read. The courtroom was packed, not with doubters or skeptics, but with supporters, journalists, students, and activists who had followed the case, drawn by the story of one man who refused to stay silent. Outside, a crowd waited, cheering as Marcus stepped onto the courthouse steps. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters shouted his name. He paused, looking not at the cameras, but up at the building behind him, the place that had almost become his undoing, and now, his redemption. He didn't smile with arrogance. He didn't raise a fist in triumph. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging the weight of what had passed and the responsibility now resting on his shoulders. Because the story didn't end with his exoneration. His company, once hanging by a thread during the trial, bounced back with stunning force. New investors came aboard, impressed not just by his vision, but by his resilience. Clients who had quietly withdrawn returned, and new ones lined up, eager to be associated with a man whose name had become synonymous with integrity. But Marcus didn't just return to business as usual. He took the platform he never asked for and turned it into a megaphone for change. He began speaking publicly, on podcasts, at universities, on national news panels. He spoke about what it meant to walk into a courtroom with the truth and still not be believed. About how bias wasn't always a slur or a shout. It could be a raised eyebrow, a cut-off sentence, a gavel slammed too soon. He became a leading voice in the movement for judicial reform, advocating for bias training, judicial review boards, and stronger oversight systems. More importantly, he inspired others. Young entrepreneurs of color who had watched his case unfold now saw a path forward, lit not just by ambition, but by courage. Law students changed their areas of focus. Activists started new campaigns. Donations to organizations like Justice Track surged, and Nia Caldwell, who had once sat silently in the back of his courtroom, now worked with Marcus to launch a new initiative, Truth in Trial. aimed at monitoring and reporting racial bias in legal proceedings nationwide. And then there was Judge Locke. The investigation into his conduct revealed years of complaints, dozens of questionable rulings, and a pattern of disproportionate sentencing along racial lines. Despite his initial denials, emails, testimonies, and courtroom footage spoke louder than his defense ever could.